Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Michelle D'Amico, and I'm the Director for Non-Credit and Public Programs at the NYU SPS Center for Global Affairs, or CGA. The CGA is currently celebrating its 15th year preparing global citizens. We do this through our 2 graduate programs, one in Global Affairs and a recently launched MS in Global Conflict, Security, and Cybercrime. We also offer a variety of professional and personal enrichment courses in the areas of global affairs and fundraising, and this includes several professional certificates. We'll send out a follow-up message to all attendees, so please feel free to reach out with any questions you may have. Now for some housekeeping for today's webinar. If you have a question for our speaker, please use the Raise Your Hand tool. We'll take questions in the order that they come in and unmute you so you can verbally ask your question. You should note that if you ask your question verbally, your name as it appears in the session will be seen by attendees. If you wish to remain anonymous, please send your question via the Q&A tool. Finally, we will be recording today's session. The identities of those who ask questions will be removed from the recording before distribution. Now to today's speakers. Dr. Carolyn Cassan serves as the Academic Director and Clinical Professor here at CGA. She leads our Energy and Environment concentration within our MS in Global Affairs program and is the faculty advisor to the Energy Policy International Club. She teaches graduate level courses examining the geopolitics of energy, comparative energy politics, energy and resource security, and a regional course focusing on Central Asia. Dr. Cassan was awarded the esteemed NYU Excellence in Teaching Award in 2007, the SPS Award for Teaching Excellence in 2009, and was nominated for the NYU-wide Distinguished Teaching Award in 2008, 2009, and 2016. Dr. Michael Shank is the Communications Director for the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, a group of international cities committed to achieving aggressive long-term carbon reduction goals. His professional career includes leading press and/or policy shops at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Climate Nexus, US Congress, Friends Committee on National Legislation, Institute for Economics and Peace, Biodiversity Northwest, Puget Soundkeeper Alliance, and more. Dr. Shank is a former columnist for the Washington Post and US News and World Report, and a contributor to USA Today, CNN, The Guardian, Time, Fast Company, Newsweek, and more. Shank lives in Brandon, Vermont, where he chairs the Planning Commission and Energy Committee, serves on the boards of the Safer Society Foundation and Compass Music and Arts Foundation. He created Brandon Films and Brandon Abroad and runs a small animal sanctuary. Dr. Shank holds a PhD from George Mason University's Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution and focuses on climate conflict. Without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to today's presenters, Professor Carolyn Cassan and Professor Michael Shank, for today's conversation.
Michelle, thank you so very much for that wonderful introduction. It is so fantastic to be here. It is such a delight to be here with Dr. Shank today. He's a dear friend, an esteemed colleague, someone that we're very grateful to have within our CGA community. And, we've been doing the COVID speaker series now since, I think, late March. I actually had the privilege of talking about COVID-19 and energy, and I sort of spoke a little bit about the impacts of COVID and thinking about climate change, but today is our opportunity with Dr. Shank to take a much deeper dive. And for those of you that know Dr. Shank's work, and for those of you that are only learning about him today, he has been very much enmeshed in climate change work really throughout his whole career. And his PhD from George Mason was actually on climate conflict. So he was writing and taking action, very early on. And, today is a chance for us to learn more and to, have an opportunity for all of you to, ask Dr. Shank questions and engage in really critical conversation. At the CGA, Dr. Shank teaches our Sustainable Development course. He teaches our Climate Change Security course, and we're hoping that he'll be teaching more courses for us in the upcoming semesters. We're really so grateful to to see you again, Michael. And I also have to say, and this is one of the things I always tell my students about when they ask me about Dr. Shank's classes, I was like, he lives it. He's coming to us today from Vermont. He lives a very sustainable lifestyle. If you see his writings, I mean, it's just a constant commitment to talking about climate change, to teaching about climate change, and to really giving us all opportunities to learn how we can take action. So, Michael, thanks so much for joining us, and I'm gonna hand it over to you.
Yay, thank you, Michelle, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Dr. Kassan, for that kind introduction. I'm thrilled to be with everyone today. I'm sorry I don't have one of my goats here to hold in front of the camera, because that would make everything much more convivial and cordial in our conversation, because bringing farm animals to the Zoom calls makes for light conversation and much needed healthier conversation right now amidst COVID. But I'm in town because my rural farm has such poor internet service that I have to use my friend's house in town for better internet service. So no goats today. I'm thrilled to be with all of you. I'm learning a lot during this time in terms of how to build the COVID climate bridge. And so this call is going to be a learning experience for me too. So hopefully we get into some good Q&A throughout, because some of what I'm testing on the call today is what I'm testing with my cities and the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance. And so we are learning as we're going, and hopefully we're going to learn together today too. Thrilled to be a part of this series. Dr. Kassan, thanks for inviting me, and I'm thrilled to be a part of CGA. I love teaching at CGA, and I think some of my former students are on this call today, so hopefully ask some good questions in the Q&A. This is a big part of my identity, the NYU CGA identity. I'm very proud of it, so thanks for having me in this conversation. So I'm gonna tick through a few ideas, a lot of images very quickly, and then shortly after 1 p.m. Eastern, we'll jump into some Q&A. So let me just share my screen right now so we can tick through some slides. All right, here we are. And let me there we go. Okay, COVID and climate. You see the CNCA logo there, that's my organization, and you'll see it throughout. I won't spend a lot of time on our cities, but our cities are really struggling right now with COVID budget cuts, as you can imagine. So this is very much part of the conversation. I think everyone knows the environmental benefits that have come from COVID, with fewer people flying, driving, using emissions, emitting emissions. You're seeing nature take back some of what we took from it, and you're seeing mountains that you've never seen before, whether you're in Nairobi, Kenya, or in northern India looking at the mountains. So it's a new time for people to take back the streets. New York obviously opening up 40 miles for pedestrians to own the streets once again. And so you're seeing a behavior change. Even in Vermont, I'm seeing more people walk and bike than ever before. People are going outside because they want to go outside. And with New York City opening up streets for pedestrian traffic versus automobile traffic, you're seeing a type of behavior change that we want to lock in post-COVID into the climate space. And what I'm talking with my cities now is the following: like, how do we affirm the behavior change that's happening in response to COVID, the good stuff, so that we can reaffirm that when hopefully there is a post-COVID. I say that in the hopes that there is a post-COVID. And when we're reacting to the climate crisis once again with increased fervor, that behavior change has been locked in. We'll talk about that in a bit. And yet, despite incredible emissions reduction, 17% this year already, we're seeing a slow return to the emissions level that we saw pre-COVID. That's a problem. So what I'm helping my cities work through is how to build this bridge in the COVID space, because a lot of my city staff who are sustainability leads, climate leads, are being seconded to COVID emergency operations centers. And a lot of budgets are being cut. And so you're seeing this redeployment of climate staff, sustainability staff in cities being seconded to health departments, frontline response, et cetera. And so cities are asking, how do we handhold this moment into the post-COVID climate space? And I've identified for them, and I'll just tick through this very quickly, 10 different narratives that are already in the press, and I'll include quotes at the bottom of each slide. so that when cities or you in your practitioner space, whoever you are, academics, activists, UN officials, international institutions, whoever is on this call, hopefully some of these narratives will be useful to you too. We know in the COVID and climate space, the scale is the same. It's affecting every country, but it's affecting developing countries differently than it's affecting developed countries because a lot of the infrastructure is not there to respond. So we're seeing the same impacts in response to the COVID crisis as we are seeing in the response to the climate crisis in terms of impacts, often hitting poor countries harder as we're seeing in COVID and climate. Understanding communicating risk, a lot of lessons to be learned here. And you see the quote at the bottom, if media and government would communicate climate the way we're communicating COVID, we could get a lot of good work done. I'm actually hopeful, and these slides will hopefully indicate and illustrate my optimism that we can carry some of these narratives over into the climate space, because our response to COVID has been overwhelming. It's been holistic, it's been whole of government, and if we can do the same in the climate space, I think we can get some good work done in terms of emissions reduction. Here, I've written a lot about this. If you want, I'm not going to talk about it today, but if you want to go to my website, michaelshank.com, I've written a lot about habitat destruction, factory farming, wet markets, deforestation, and how that is pandemic producing or pandemic promoting. Same in the climate space in terms of our impact with fossil fuels, our use of fossil fuels, and the impact on the climate crisis, planetary crisis. So you're seeing some similarities, some analogies here, and some parallels between our footprint, if you will, both in producing pandemics, but also in producing a planetary crisis. COVID shows that scientists know what they're talking about, and we should listen to science. In the United States, there's obviously a battle in the White House on this front with Fauci and the president, but most countries are listening to science, following science, and in the climate space, we need to do the same. Incredible collaboration across all of government, local, city, state, international. We need to increase and continue that collaboration across all levels of government and even, subnational and national space into the climate world too, post-COVID. Subnationals are increasing in prominence, and national governments are increasingly allowing them into the conversation. Post-Paris climate talks, you're seeing much more fortified role for subnationals. This is good because we need them in the climate space just like we needed them in the COVID space. Our response to COVID shows that we can indeed act on climate change. We did it, and the wartime effort, we'll talk on war a little later, but you see from CNN, this was a wartime response. These are wartime efforts, and we need to continue that in the climate space. Again, the importance of prevention and preparedness with COVID, same with climate. So some of these themes that I'm reiterating, I'm hoping that my cities, I'm hoping you will lift up when we are building this bridge between COVID and climate. What are the values that we can reaffirm that are important, that are positive, and that we can encourage societies to continue to do? Sustainable recovery, so a lot of stimulus money being spent in the trillions globally, and so our cities have weighed in here. This is a letter that we submitted to financial leaders and got a whole bunch of sign-ons, as you can see below, some of the logos there from our fellow city signatories. Encouraging the following: when you build back, make sure it's equitable, make sure it's just, make sure it's inclusive, make sure it's sustainable, make sure it's regenerative, make sure that we uphold existing environmental regulations, and let's adopt some parameters going forward around sustainability and risk disclosures and standards, etc. So this can be found on our website if you want to read more, but our cities are weighing in heavily because stimulus money is coming out the door quickly, as you know. And unless we have these preconditions attached, we're going to fall back into the pre-COVID normal, which was not at all sustainable. A couple more slides here. Having well-funded healthcare systems, critical to COVID clearly, but also critical to climate, because fossil fuels and air pollution killing 7 million people prematurely globally each year. So in terms of a well-fortified healthcare response to COVID, we also need it for the climate crisis. And then I want to end the narrative slides here in talking about behavior change, because I've even seen some climate reporters acknowledge pre-COVID, they were saying, this isn't really about behavior change. This isn't really about changing your diets. This isn't really about having smaller families. We need systems change. These were climate reporters. Then COVID comes along and they acknowledge, they have a bit of a mea culpa on social, saying, okay, we recognize it's both behavior change and systems change. There is a debate in the climate space. Is it behavior change or systems change? It's both and. COVID shows that, but also the climate crisis shows that too. And as Carolyn Kassan mentioned, I do try to walk the talk because I think that's critical. If I want to be a messenger in this space, I need to walk the talk. Okay, so the public presentation of problems. COVID was presented well as a problem. Now, for the most part, globally, the whole world got behind the presentation of this problem. There's some clear outliers here in terms of backing down from that presentation of problems, but this is important, and it comes with the war rhetoric too. We like to create an us versus them. This is natural, and that plays upon our biological tendencies to belong and to want to belong. And oftentimes an enemy will be useful in creating that sense of belonging, that sense of community. That's why this war framing has been helpful in the past. A lot of people didn't use it in the climate space. I heartily encourage it. Bill McKibben has written on it. My dissertation was on this. And I do think we can create a war with an invisible enemy. The problem with the climate space is that it's often our behavior that we need to change. So it's hard to create an enemy out of ourselves, but could we create an enemy out of fossil fuels and make that the vilified bad guy here? And we had a lot of celebrities in this campaign, in this war. Now, I want to identify, some of you saw this, New York Times did this incredible layout of the 100,000 dead, the nearly 100,000 dead. And they really memorialized, if you scrolled through their interactive on this, all the people throughout this country who have died from COVID. And we're seeing visuals of these refrigerated morgues, and I mean, devastating wartime visuals, like the war front is here. We're seeing these visuals, and I'm bringing this up because we haven't yet seen this in the climate space, despite the fact, and this is from the WHO. So we relied on the WHO for COVID. Now can we rely on the WHO for climate crisis? And how do we create some of the same narratives, some of the same visuals? I would love for the New York Times to do an interactive of the climate deaths that are happening in hospitals. These aren't deaths that are happening on the street, so they're not as visible, but we were able to tabulate and memorialize the COVID deaths, which is important. How can we do the same in this war on fossil fuels, in this climate war that we need to visualize at the same level that we were able to visualize some of the COVID crisis? Here are some climate impacts that are very visual, and how do we use them in this war, in this winning of the hearts and minds, so that we get people as bought into the behavior change that's necessary in response to the climate crisis as they have with the COVID crisis. I want to give a quick reference in case folks are like, well, Michael, I don't think we can wage this war. People don't want to change behaviors. For those of you who were around in our response to the ozone hole, you saw scientists switch their narrative to the ozone shield and reference some of the Hollywood narratives that were useful to helping people understand that we needed to get rid of CFCs, we needed to get rid of aerosol cans so that we could protect ourselves, that we could rebuild the shield so that Ronald Reagan wouldn't get skin cancer on his face. And there was this incredible rallying and use of Hollywood imagery in terms of protecting ourselves. And I set this up as a precedent for what's possible in the climate space. So how do we, again, and this may feel cheap, especially for climate scientists who hope that the data will win the day. I don't think the data will win the day in terms of winning the hearts and minds. And we do need to create some creative campaigning here to win the hearts and minds. Now, this work that my cities are doing, I'm just identifying some game changers that they're very involved with in terms of decarbonizing their cities, decarbonizing transportation, decarbonizing buildings, decarbonizing everything. This is what our cities are doing. It's incredible. They're leading the way. They are the vanguard. And yet, as I mentioned earlier, budgets are being cut. So pre-COVID, they were moving fast and furiously towards these fronts to decarbonize and create really energy efficient, renewable systems. And now we're cutting budgets. So how are they going to move forward when budgets are being cut, both in terms of lower revenue because we don't have business up and running, and in terms of money's moved to deal with the COVID crisis? I am a firm believer in campaigning. Anything that we do, and if you've read The Economist's piece this week, they're doing a lot on climate, thankfully, and especially of late. And this week they're talking about a carbon price. They're talking about ending subsidies for fossil fuels. They're talking about things that are policy dependent, but require, I think, a winning of the hearts and minds to get behind either carbon pricing, because if you've watched carbon pricing fail in Washington State, as an example, it's been tried several times there. The fossil fuel dollars come in and win the hearts and minds through incredible ad marketing dollars. And so how can we, when city policy budgets are being cut, help win the hearts and minds, taking some lessons learned from the COVID crisis response and apply them to the climate crisis response? Here's a problem I have. And you see a lot of candidates doing it. Biden did it, but before Biden, a bunch of other presidential, and I assume everyone on this call is stateside. Forgive me, some of you might be overseas, so forgive some of the US references here, but even Bernie Sanders, my senator, did it. Existential threat, existential threat, existential threat. Watch them talk climate and then watch them talk COVID. There is an urgency in their talk about COVID that is not visible in their talk about climate. Yes, Bernie Sanders will be like, we've got to deal with this existential threat. And Biden will be as emphatic about it. And yet the language used feels distant, even though existential threat means a threat to your life, a threat to your existence. So definitionally, okay, I could die from the climate crisis. 7 million people die prematurely every year, according to WHO, because of air pollution. So I could die, yes, it's an existential threat. And of course, the climate impacts the extreme weather that come with it. But they're not using the same language. And every time any presidential candidate has used it, I tweet at them like, hey, please stop using existential threat, because no one, in terms of public, winning the hearts and minds, is like, oh, existential threat, wow, I could get that. I could contract that, I could get that. Whereas COVID has an immediacy. And yet more people are dying from the climate crisis, from air pollution every year in comparison. If you've not seen this video, watch it. All you have to do is Google it, maybe after the call, maybe not right now. I'd show it if I could, but that'd be time poorly spent. But this is a kind of cultural response that I think we're going to need going forward with climate. Basically, Tadric Hall is doing this incredible, we did it as staff too, mask, gloves, soap, scrubs. They're making our response to COVID entertaining. And the climate messaging up till this point has largely eluded this kind of cultural appeal, because people have relied on the data. They hoped that the data would win the day. Hey, everyone, if we don't cut emissions in half by 2030, we're toast. I mean, it was heavy on data, not a lot of fun. Yes, it's burdensome to think about, but how do we make it palatable to the public? And how do we, again, take some lessons from the COVID response, excuse me, with all these C's, and apply them to the climate response? This is out of Oregon. Again, really interesting marketing here, where they're trying to appeal to people who on social media are very busy, very distracted, and they're cutting through with really interesting marketing. So again, when we're trying to win the hearts and minds, how do we understand what is distracting someone in their day-to-day with social media and apply similar principles? This is what can get in the way of your audience. Just a few more slides and we'll jump into Q&A. This is getting in the way of your audience's ability to do the right thing on the climate front, to change behavior. Now, some of the social norming that I am showing you here in the bottom left corner, I think, for your viewing. Think of the Tadric Hall video that I mentioned. That was an attempt to socially norm the wearing of masks, the wearing of gloves, using soap and cleaning everything. That was an attempt to socially norm a behavior that we need to see for the next year in response to COVID. So how do we do some of this stuff in the climate space? And how are we mindful of what could get in the way of behavior change? Loss aversion in the middle. This is really interesting. So let's say people get attached in Nairobi or in northern India, northern Pakistan, to these new views. Now that the pollution is gone, they can see the Himalayas, they can see these mountains. Can we create such an attachment to this new reality, pre-COVID, post-COVID, so that people don't want to lose it going forward? And they're more inclined to keep emissions down so that they can see those beautiful mountains. Thinking about anything that's happening now with behavior change in response to COVID. Again, people are walking more, they're biking more. Let's lock in those behaviors so that people don't want to lose that positive experience they had during COVID going into the climate response. There are a bunch more here that I could talk through, and I'm happy to follow up with anyone later. If you're thinking about, all right, well, how do we make any of these green behaviors in response to climate hassle-free, or something I tell my cities all the time, top left, choice overload. My cities overwhelm often audiences with, hey, here are 12 things you need to do to go green. And people are overwhelmed. Either they don't have time, they don't have resources, it's the end of the day and they've been working, then they have kids and it's like too much. Just tell me one thing. Just tell me one thing I can do to help the climate right now. And it can't be just straws, because there's a big socially normed focus on straws right now, which is great. Foot in the door, then we need to open it up and do more, something more substantive. So being mindful of what gets in the way of behavior change will be key going forward. And then I think I'll just bring these up very quickly and talk through a few of them. This is what I'm encouraging my cities to think about all the time. And for those of you who have heard me talk about this before, hopefully this will be a helpful reminder. Messages. In the climate space, I encourage my cities to let go of the environmental message and lead with quality of life, lead with health, lead with economics, lead with ego. All the things that really drive most people. Yes, if you've got an environmental nonprofit that you're talking to, yes, you can lead with the environmental message, but we have to let go a lot of attachment to the climate data, the environmental framing, because what appeals to a lot of people is health. Are they gonna live another day? And if you look at some of the messaging in the COVID space, of course, there's a lot of health, but quality of life, economics messaging, and appealing to people's ego, I think is gonna be key. Messengers. I had that celebrity picture of people wearing masks, Gwyneth Paltrow, Selena Gomez. So similarly in the climate space, are we tapping cultural influencers to really socially norm green behaviors beyond just an EV, moving into plant-based diets, moving into sustainable fashion, things that are uncomfortable for a lot of people to switch. Mainstream majority, how do we use language that they use? You know, I encourage my cities to not talk decarbonization, to not talk carbon neutrality, to not talk retrofit accelerators, to not talk net zero anything, because that's not what the public is using. And so how do we use the language that the mainstream majority is using? I'm gonna just pass through a few of these. Multiples, repeating. I think one thing that was beneficial to the COVID messaging is that there was a lot of repetition in terms of what we wanted people to do. It was a pretty simple ask. It wasn't choice overload. They weren't overwhelmed by the ask. It was a pretty simple ask: wear your mask and carry some hand sanitizer with you. Now, that was repeated over and over again by the CDC, and that was helpful. Let me just tick through. If you look at the bottom half, memes, magic, mimicry, mirroring, movement building, what is that? And as a professor, I think a lot of my colleagues on the call might feel like, okay, Michael, you're really moving into advocacy. But for me, it's all advocacy. Yes, it needs to be grounded in science. Yes, it needs to be grounded in good research. But we don't have time. I remember Leo DiCaprio saying in the UN, we don't have time for more reports. We need action. And this is where it's so important. The me is me, Michael Shank, walking the talk. I can't preach if I'm not also walking that talk. And so I try to live it in all aspects of my life so that I can be a good messenger. Magic, if you've not seen a Geico commercial, watch one. They know how to sell something. They sell through entertainment, and at the last 5 seconds of their ad, they lock in the sale. Similar to that Todrick Hall video that I showed in terms of mask gloves, soap scrubs. How can we entertain people in this space? They want to be entertained. Oftentimes we lead with the sale, like act on climate, decarbonize, fill in the blank, take action. Whereas people, especially now, given the depression that's pervasive in this COVID space, depression and anger, a lot of anger. If we're gonna build a bridge into the climate space, we have to be very careful that we don't lead with similarly burdensome, heavy energy, because they're just gonna be like, you know what, I'm done, I need a break. COVID was too much for me. I need something lighter. And so I think we're gonna have to be very careful as we build that bridge to make sure we do it with some lightness that may feel antithetical to the heaviness of the work and the heaviness of the data. And then the last one's around mirroring, movement building, and mimicry. I mean, we are animals at the heart of it. I see this every day with my animals. I see so many similarities between how my animals respond to each other and how humans respond to each other. But if we can set up, and I encourage my cities to do this all the time, if we can set up a mirroring back of the communities and the lifestyles that we want to build, so that if you go to your city's website, you're seeing yourself and your community, your neighbors on their site taking action. Especially now that we're heavily moving into the virtual space, how do we create communities that are affirming each other through social norming? Because we know that if you see someone's solar panels, you're more likely to get solar if your neighbor has solar. Or if you learn that your neighbor is saving a ton of money through energy efficiency, you're more likely to pursue those same energy efficiency measures because you want to best your neighbor in terms of what they're saving. Now, given we're virtual, how do we create those social norm spaces? And given that a lot of what we need people to do is inside their home, like we need people to get off gas and oil furnaces, for example, and switch to heat pumps that are powered by solar, as an example. Well, that's hard to socially norm that because that's inside my home and I can't really show that to anyone like I can show my solar panels or I can show my electric vehicle and things like that. So I just did a presentation recently on building electrification and how do we storytell virtually what's happening inside the home that's green, including energy efficiency measures, so we can create a movement in the virtual space. So I'm happy to talk with folks later if you're building campaigns, climate campaigns, and want to tick through any of these M's. I'm not going to address all of them now because I want us to get into Q&A. But as you can see, I'm heavily focused on campaigning. I do think with limited budgets, we need to win the hearts and minds. And if that's around carbon pricing and ending fossil fuel subsidies, which are 5.3 trillion every year in terms of what governments pay, a lot of that's going to be reliant on a pretty smart marketing campaign to win the hearts and minds. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kassan to get us into some Q&A.
Michael, thank you so very much. As expected, fantastic presentation. Very grateful for all of your, really, really interesting insights and for also the optimism that you brought to your presentation in terms of the action that people can take. So I'm going to start with the question, but I'm going to encourage all of our audience. If you would like to ask Dr. Shank a direct question, please use the please use the hand raise function. Otherwise, you can ask a question through the Q&A, and I will ask Michael your question. So you have two ways of asking a question, but we do really encourage and hope that that many of you will take this opportunity and ask Dr. Shank a question or two. So maybe I'll just get us started. So you talked about like not sort of pre-COVID and that sort of a lot of people talk about returning to normal after this crisis. One of the things I know that you've also talked about is that we don't want to return to that normal, that pre-COVID normal. We need to make the types of changes that you discuss. One of the things that concerns me is, and that I sort of follow hydrocarbon markets and the like, is that, we have seen a dramatic decline in the price of oil as well as gas. And there's concern that that might slow the transition to renewable energy sources because fossil fuels are so cheap. And then maybe the second part of my question would be, so China has started to open up. And one of the interesting things that, that we're seeing in China is that there's still a lot of health concerns about taking mass transit. So we've seen an uptick in the use of individual vehicles and even mobility on demand, but fossil-based vehicles. So I totally agree with you in terms of how we need to sort of really build out the infrastructure for more cycling. And I think, countries like Denmark are tremendous leaders that, we can look at. And I know Paris, Milan, some other cities are in fact doing that, but there's also that threat that, people will be afraid to take mass transit and thereby they'll turn to the, fossil-based vehicles, the internal combustion engine. So if you could just maybe talk briefly about the, the cost issue around renewables, and then in terms of just around sort of what that new normal could look like with regards to transportation.
Yeah, and again, referring people to The Economist this week, and props to The Economist because they had taken the climate crisis seriously pre-COVID, but to their credit, over the last several issues, they have prioritized it in a way that I've not seen them prioritize it before. So if we have more media outlets doing that, that will be helpful. And this week, they talked a lot about what Dr. Kassan is talking about in terms of oil and gas and bottoming out of the market and the prices, and they thought this would be an opportune time because of that to end subsidies and certainly not to prioritize them in bailouts. And you'll see countries like France encouraging their airlines, Air France, to not service places that trains can access, as an example. So you're seeing some creative response. Some countries are bailing out fossil fuels. Economists was encouraging now, especially not to bail out fossil fuels and not to subsidize. And they also noted this week, and Dr. Kassan and I was just reading up on some of their articles since our last call, since our call together, and seeing that renewables actually had seen a uptick in terms of purchases this quarter, which is good. And you noted in your call some of the forecasting that later this year, we might see a resumption of perhaps pre-COVID prices around oil especially, which will help with the transition off, because we think about this locally in Vermont. How do we inspire, how do we motivate, how do we incentivize people to get off their oil burning furnaces and switch to heat pumps, as an example? And now is tough because heating oil is so cheap. And so the cost messaging for the moment won't be there for us. Quality of life messaging could be because your house is less stinky and less loud. I can speak from personal experience without an oil furnace versus with heat pumps. So there's some quality of life messaging opportunities there. Cost might be a minute before it returns, but good to see in terms of international markets in the last quarter, renewables still rising, which is good. And I think that will continue to be the case. But these are conundrums. I also don't claim that I have the answers here, Dr. Kassan. In terms of China mass transit, yes, I assume we'll see this for a while until people in their risk calculation decide to return to their pre-COVID normal in terms of how they might navigate mass transit. Will people be driving more? Yes. Are cities turning to on-demand more? Yes. And there's been some creative response to this. You just Google cities response around mass transit. There's some really creative responses in terms of still helping mass transit move forward, but being slightly more app friendly in terms of people's use of it. I will say though, and I wrote something recently on EVs, having learned that my town has the founder of the first electric motor and the first electric vehicle, Thomas and Emily Davenport, that in a place like Vermont, we have a Republican governor, and granted, he's more moderate than most, but the one thing that's moving forward fast and furiously across the state, even though we are the slowest in our climate response, we're way behind our climate goals. And in New England, we're the poorest performer statewide in terms of comparison to like Massachusetts or New York State, et cetera. But where there is clear bipartisan agreement, and even my testing out narratives with my Republican friends here, EVs are the safest territory to move forward. And I think that will continue to be the case, and I think we will have to exploit it. Now, do we want to switch every fossil fuel driver to an EV and that will somehow save the day? No, because that's using a lot of resources. And we do need to get other forms of mass transit up and running. But in this on-demand shift that will probably characterize the next couple of years worth of mass transit, let's just make sure all those vehicles are electrified. And I do think there's a lot of bipartisan opportunity here to move forward on those fronts. So I'm hopeful that we can switch that, we can flip these fleets pretty quickly, because the materials are there, the electric buses out of Shenzhen are there. And so we just need the public will to make the city purchase or the state purchase happen quickly.
Excellent. So I have a question from the audience. You talked about the positive climate impact of COVID. People walk more and the pollution level decreased. There are several issues where it actually seemed like we had the foot in the door pre-COVID, such as the ban of plastic bags and the use of reusable cups. Due to the pandemic, these changes have often been postponed or abandoned on a personal, city, and/or state level. How do you make sure that behavior changes are permanent, no matter the challenges we are facing?
Yeah, plastics is tough because we were just getting there, as the person noted, and thanks for this question, because we were making a lot of progress on plastics. I think there was broad public awareness around the problem of plastics in general. And that was a great foot in the door to bigger behavior change. And then COVID comes along and plastics are back, especially around PPE, and we're using more plastic than we ever did before. Now, this will be a problem for the next couple of years. And I think what will happen is that in the PPE space and in the other pervasive use of plastics, we'll see innovation in terms of people's replacement of with something more biodegradable and less harmful to the planet. But yeah, I don't have any fast fixes on this or great answers, because we have lost a couple of years on the plastics front, because people's paranoia with pandemics will increase disposability of so much, when we need to be, and why our city is identified regenerative, because we need to be making use of this material forever and ever. And we can't be discarding, we can't be using and discarding, using and discarding. So yeah, it's on this front, especially the next couple of years are a few lost years with plastics.
Excellent, thank you. And now we have a question from one of CGA's own, Anne-Marie Gertz. Anne-Marie, Michelle is going to unmute you and you can ask your question.
Thank you so much for your talk, so inspiring. I was thinking about an analogy about the way the COVID pandemic has kind of given us like a window, an opening, but we shouldn't be fooled about the amount of work that is to come. It's a little bit like, you know, when an alcoholic doesn't drink for a day and thinks that they're just going to be fine from now on. And I was thinking about the COVID pandemic and the climate change benefits that we've had, being just like, that's a taster, but we have a lot of work to do. The question I wanted to ask was actually about the politics of the kinds of changes that you're proposing. Because a couple of weeks ago, Michael Oppenheimer, on this same series of talks, said that politics, and this really hit me between the eyes, politics is about emotion and competition. It's not about data. It's not about logic. It's not about rationality, which you've made that point as well. I think the emotional case for taking action now, springboarding from this COVID pandemic to say we can really make the changes that we need, the emotional case is pretty much there amongst, I would say, young and educated and coast-based or city-based populations around the world. But what needs to happen to get this into the resistant majority? What is it? What needs to happen? And I was going to ask you about like whether there's any evidence of movement building that is bridge building or building alliances with the resistant majority in rural areas or in kind of standard capitalist communities that don't want to make a change to their practices. Can you see climate change movements expanding and bringing in some of these communities?
It's a great question. Can I see it expanding? It's tough. I grew up on the farm in Ohio in a small Amish Mennonite community and then spent 20 years in big cities, and now I've returned to a small community, largely farm-based, though a little bit more diverse than my Ohio experience growing up. And I'm imagining all of my climate colleagues, not all, but many of my climate colleagues in big cities and how they talk about rural communities and how they talk about farming communities. And the divide remains. Now, will there be a more compassionate, all-inclusive approach going forward post-COVID? I don't know. There needs to be. Do we need entirely new messengers leading that movement? Probably, because there's so many hangups now and such a divide now, unfortunately, that it will continue to be an obstacle for the kind of unifying approach. And maybe it's health practitioners, you know, the healthcare workers are heroes, as they should be now. And they were emerging on the climate messaging stage pre-COVID. I and many others helped lift up some of those voices in the press. Now that they have a prominent place in society, could they lead the movement, a more unifying movement in terms of dealing with forthcoming crises? And we'll definitely have more pandemics, we know this. And they'll be probably equally deadly, hopefully not. Hopefully we'll be able to respond in time and shut down factory farming and things like that that produces these pandemics. But I think we need, this is a great question, I think we need, and I'm thinking through this clearly as I answer it, but I think we need new movement builders and new messengers, and maybe this is a piece I should write, that they are the ones to lead it, because they have been heroized, and rightly so, but they might be the unifying platform that people can, all stripes of American society can appreciate and support and be led into this new space. A quick anecdote, I'm thinking of running for state house locally in Vermont. And while, just all the cards on the table here, while I've voted blue in the past, I'm not, if I run, I'm not gonna run as a Democrat, I'm gonna run as an independent. A lot of people have pushed back on that because, oh, you're not gonna get party support, blah, blah, blah. And my point was, in running as an independent, is that a lot of people know me for the rescue farm that I have, and they know me as a generally friendly person in town who helps out when he can. And I want them to vote for that. And they could, if I was running as an independent, not betray their party lines and support me as an independent and support Michael Shank for office. But if I ran as a Democrat, that would immediately get in the way of their ability to support me, because it would be a betrayal of their own identity. And I think that will probably plague climate organizing forever. And so who are the new messengers who can lead a movement? And I don't think it's the old messengers. I think we need an entirely new movement and people to lead those movements. Thanks for that question, because it definitely got me thinking on this. This is great.
Yeah, and Anne-Marie, she teaches in our Global Gender Studies concentration, and she had an amazing talk a couple of weeks ago on COVID, gender, and women, peace, and security. Mm-hmm. All right, so I've got a question here from someone in our audience. You spoke a lot about the grassroots efforts that can be taken, i.e. switching from furnaces to heat pumps. You also spoke a little bit about the international cooperation aspect of the climate crisis, which is heavily dependent on our federal government. As the November election approaches, how do we generate the buy-in for these crucial grassroots efforts to be ingrained in the federal public policy agenda?
Yeah, The Economist also talked about, so hopefully folks read The Economist articles because I keep referring to them. They talked about the growing lobby within renewables. When I worked in Congress, renewables did not have a lobby. Fossil fuels has had a lobby forever, for much of the 20th century included. And renewables haven't had much of a presence in Washington previously, and so that's changing, thankfully. But in thinking about who can pressure Washington, and if you don't have money, how do you pressure Washington? When I moved to Washington, I was like, okay, I don't have money. How can I have power? How can I pressure politicos? And part of that was in the press. But in thinking about how you impact federal conversations, how you impact state, which leads to federal, or local, which leads to state, which leads to federal, in thinking about pulling out all the stops, and it may be exhausting, and thinking about the COVID response, people are exhausted. And the climate response will require the same if we really want to see federal policy change. And I could just do a poll right now to see who has reached out to any of their representatives along the state and federal spectrum. And if you haven't, this isn't to like shame or guilt to anyone, but if you haven't, how do you turn your climate-friendly member of Congress or state legislature into a real advocate? There are very few. I could list on a couple of hands the strong climate advocates in the House and the Senate in Washington, for example. They are not the whole of the body, people who think climate science is real. The whole of those bodies are not advocating, are not messaging like they need to. There are a handful. But how do we turn people who are on our side into strong messengers? And a lot of that depends on you pushing them to do so. So when it may feel like we're overwhelmed in terms of our ability to lobby because we don't have money, there are so many other ways to lobby. And if you ever write on these issues and want quick feedback on a piece that you're writing for a member of Congress or for your local paper or for the state paper, reach out to me because I'm happy to help. That's the point of me, one of the reasons I'm at CGA, because I want to support people who are creating sustainable worlds out there in New York and beyond. And it's going to require a lot of pressure on us, on them going forward.
Yeah, and I just want to echo what Michael just said, just in terms of what he does in the classroom and with his students. I mean, you're such a wonderful advocate for students really using their voices, both in terms of verbally, but also through their writing, and really sort of think about, the power of the written word to affect change. And that's something I know many of your students, comment that they really sort of took so much away in terms of the importance and the criticality of effective communication. So we have a question from another CGA member of the full-time faculty, WPS Sidhu, and Professor Sidhu leads our relatively new UN specialization. And as many of you probably also know, is that Michael has had a lot of long career working with the United Nations around the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So Sidhu, you're unmuted to ask your question.
Thank you very much, Professor Kisan and Michael. Wonderful presentation as always. But of course, my UN class has already had the benefit of some of those insights. So many, many thanks. Two things. One comment which I'd very much appreciate your, kind of response to, and another very specific question. The comment is, everybody's making the links between COVID-19 and climate, and how we might want to use that to address climate change. But I think there's a more fundamental linkage which we seem to be missing out on. And that is that if you look at the outbreak of COVID, it's actually happened in cities where, which were the most polluted in terms of air pollution worldwide. And in some ways, so you look at Wuhan, you look at certainly, all the cities in India as well. And there is a clear overlap there between, given that COVID-19 is obviously a pulmonary, attacks the pulmonary system, there is a linkage there. And in some ways, the fact that the one way to address COVID-19 would actually be to make sure that you maintain the clean air. And this comes back a little bit to the dilemma that Professor Kisan was talking about, in terms of not going back to mass transportation, etc. So I'd love to get your comment on that. The second question is really got to do with your, carbon neutral city alliances, and two aspects there. Number one, I'm just curious how many of your 40 odd cities are in the global south? How many of them fall under this category of the air pollution that we've been talking about, including Wuhan? And do you see a greater linkage in the UN to connect with cities as independent actors from the states that they belong to? Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you, Sidhu. It's great to hear from you. And thanks for these questions. To your first point about cities that have cleaner air have some buffer from higher COVID cases. And there are a lot of good data behind this that folks may know about. If you just Google Harvard's study, they saw a strong correlation between dirty air and COVID cases and COVID deaths. So I like, and this reaffirmed some of the earlier thinking we did in response to Emery's question around having healthcare workers lead the new movement. This fits in nicely there, that if people are super scared about COVID's return, knowing that cleaner air will help them, it won't, protect them entirely, but cleaner air means you're less likely to get COVID. I like that messaging a lot. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, a lot of us are still figuring our way through this COVID climate bridge. So thank you for that, because I think that's a really strong message. Secondly, to your point about how many of our cities and the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance are in the global south, we had previously been representing the vanguard, those cities that were taking leaps ahead in terms of their ambitious, aggressive targets around carbon emissions reductions. We're changing that focus going forward to help any city who needs help globally to ratchet up their game-changing policies. I had a slide previously that I won't go to now that looked at some of our game-changing policy in our cities. And we want to scale that up and roll that out to any city that wants to take on any of those initiatives. And so going forward, because we've very much wanted to be working in cities in China and cities in India, we have some representation in the global south, but not near as much as we need to and want to. So we're changing our whole paradigm going forward, which I'm excited by, because that's where the work needs to happen. And I'm excited to help cities do that work. To your point about how much is the UN involving cities as real actors and stakeholders here, you're seeing a lot of talk within UNDP circles and other circles about taking the nationally determined contributions, which were part of the Paris climate talks. For folks, if you've heard of the NDCs before, those are nationally based because the Paris talks were predicated on national action, and you're seeing a moving out, a widening of that policy parameter to include subnationals. because they recognize that nationals aren't moving at the pace we need them to do, and so cities are moving at the pace that we need. And so how do we have subnationals lead? And it's an uncomfortable space for the UN, because their whole premise is nationals. And now that we're saying subnationals are leading and could create some competition for nationals, and we need a subnational, nationally determined contribution, a sub-nationally determined contribution. Doesn't roll trippingly off the tongue. We need new language for that. But thankfully, we are seeing a widening of those doors, so the subnational actors are welcomed. Had we been in Glasgow this year for the latest COP, Glasgow is a new city of Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, a new member of Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, you would have seen a much more centered, focused, grounded city role, city voice in the COP talks in Glasgow. We will see that next time we meet for the COP talks, the Conference of Parties conversations around climate. So thankfully, yeah, cities are now coming to play and being welcomed for their role in climate action.
Okay, I think we have time only for one more question. I'm going to take a question from the audience. There's an elephant in the room for climate change, and that is population growth. While correlation is not necessarily causality, yet the exponential growth of population seems directly in line with pollution growth. Further, even if population is stabilized right now, growth in economic wealth will increase pollution. How do you address such an emotional issue that is hardwired into the human psyche?
Way to save the biggest question for last, the most controversial one. I have written on this as someone who has chosen not to have kids, but is very much a big brother to my neighbors' kids who come over to hang out with the animals all day, and I take that role seriously and continue to play that role, will continue to play the role. But I've written on this topic. It's tough, and for those of you who are reading on this came up in The Guardian recently too. And it's ultimately about consumption, because rich countries have a bigger footprint because they're consuming more. You know, you could be in a less resource, less developed country and have a bigger family, and your footprint, your consumption would be negligible compared to a rich country footprint or consumption. So anytime we're talking about this issue, and as The Guardian talked about, consumption has to be front and center because it's really about consumption. Now, can we make consumption sustainable for 10 billion people when the cultural influences are so strong in terms of consuming more, having a bigger house, eating meat as part of being rich or being well off? There's so many heavy footprints associated with making it or arriving, unless we change that through cultural campaigns that change what it means to be well off, and that, you know, changing some of those frameworks around even meat or big house or big car, any of the lots of clothes, things like that. It's really about consumption. I have written about it, and I wrote about it for Newsweek. I thought I would get more pushback. I got a pretty positive response on social media, which surprised me. Now, I addressed the eugenics of the past and how problematic that was, and I also was writing it for a rich audience in the United States, and so I was clear about that. But we do need to talk about it, and that was my point of the piece. I was like, hey, let's at least have a conversation, because too often it's been dismissed, understandably so, because in previous iterations it was deeply racist. And if we talk about it, we have to make sure we're cognizant of the proclivity of the conversation to go in that direction, intentionally or inadvertently. So I think if we do talk about it, we have to be very mindful of the precedent there. But I do think we have to talk about it and accompany it with consumption, because it's really tied heavily to consumption. For the person who asked that question, if you Google, I'm happy to send it to you later, or if you Google Newsweek, you'll find it. But you could also email me here and I can send it to you, so we can continue that conversation.
Excellent. Well, Michael, thank you so very much. I'm sure I'm speaking for everyone from our audience when I say how grateful that we all are to you for today's presentation and for your openness with how you addressed all the questions. And I know that by the way, there are many more questions that we were not able to get to. So I will put those together and send those to you if at some point you'd like to address them. But we really do appreciate how thoughtful you were, and how much you've given us to think about and to act on. So very grateful. And also, before people leave, we also want to remind you that we have, on Thursday, we'll be doing our next CGA COVID speaker series, and we'll have Dr. Sylvia Meyer back again. This will be her second talk on when the world stood still, COVID-19 and global migration and refugee policy. And we do very much hope that you will join us.